Traditionally, the Buddha's first sermon is said to be the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. That's quite a mouthful in Pali, but basically it means the rolling forth of the wheel of the Dharma. This is a very famous and important sutta, but it has a number of interesting historical problems, which I'll get into. So in today's video, what I want to do first is I'll discuss a little bit about the idea of the wheel, this metaphor that occurs in the title and in the sutta. Then I'll turn to these historical problems or some issues with it. And then last, I'll get to the content of the sutta, and in particular, two important things that the Buddha really wants to discuss in it. So first, let's discuss the wheel as metaphor for the Dharma that we see in the title of this sutta. Now, the wheel has been a very important symbol in Indian history. It has many, many resonances. I can't get into all of them, but we can think of the sun, for example, the disk of the sun being related to the disk of the wheel. We can think of the wheel as related to change, to samsara, the cyclical nature of life that takes us up and down, where we have success and then failure, all of these worldly winds. And also we can think of the wheel-turning monarch. Very important idea in Indian history and in Buddhism as well. This idea of the monarch, the king that unites all of the areas around India in a dharmic kingdom. Now, this last metaphor of the wheel-turning king is, I think, the one that is closest to the importance of this sutta, the one that's most relevant here. In the sutta, however, the Buddha doesn't bring up this idea of the wheel of the Dharma. That's spoken at the end of the sutta, or near the end, by a chorus of deities, basically who are standing in for the public who's watching what the Buddha is talking about. And what the deities have to say is this: the Buddha has rolled forth the supreme wheel of Dharma, and that wheel cannot be rolled back by any ascetic or Brahmin or God or Mara or Brahma or by anyone in the world. So there are connotations here of the Buddhist Dharma sort of rolling throughout the world like a conquering chariot, or a group of conquering chariots, if we like. There, again, this metaphor or idea of conquering armies of the Buddhist Dharma, as we will eventually see in Indian history with Emperor Ashoka, for example. The wheel is an essential part of the chariot, and many of us will know that the chariot plays an important role in Buddhist Dharma as being a metaphor for the person, that a person is like a chariot and being made up of parts. The chariot is also an extremely important symbol of power. It was, in fact, at the time, a relatively new technology, a technology of power that gave power to kings and armies that could use the chariot against their enemies. So again, there are echoes here of the notion of the Chakravartin, the wheel-turning monarch who conquers the world under the aegis of the Dharma. Now, second, I want to turn to some historical issues with this purported first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Now, if we look elsewhere in the early suttas, we find that perhaps, arguably, the earliest account of the Buddha's enlightenment is in a sutta called the Noble Search. It's a different sutta. But in that sutta, the story goes on to tell of the Buddha's discussions right after he became enlightened with a number of different people. For example, with the god, the Brahma Sahampati, who he has a discussion with about whether he's going to teach. He has a discussion with an ascetic named Upaka on the road, where he says that he has become enlightened, and Upaka seems a little bit unsure of that. And then finally there is a discussion with the first 5 ascetics who were under the Buddha's tutelage. These are the same 5 ascetics we find in the Buddha's supposed first sermon. However, in this sermon, the Sermon on the Noble Search, the discussion between the Buddha and these 5 early ascetics is different. Now, these 5 ascetics were the people that the Buddha was practicing with before he became enlightened, with whom he was undergoing a bunch of these very austere practices. But after becoming enlightened, again in this Sutta on the Noble Search, the Buddha's first discussion with them, again at least in this sutta, is about the 5 chords of sense pleasure. he's discussing with them how sense pleasures have dangers that we have to be alert to, that these dangers are sort of personified by Mara, the tempter god, who keeps us attached to the world through these sense desires. And the Buddha goes on to discuss how we can blind Mara, how we can stop Mara from tempting us, blind him, by engaging in deep forms of meditative absorption. In particular, the Buddha goes through what are known as the 4 jhanas, then the 4 formless attainments, and finally the Buddha even discusses the attainment of the cessation of perception and feeling, which is the deepest of these and is sort of akin to an attainment of nirvana. So in this early sutta, this discussion, this apparent first discussion between the Buddha and his 5 early disciples, is presented as a discussion about sense desire and how deep meditative attainments can help us break our sense desires, break our attachment to the world, which is, as we'll see, a very different kind of message than the one that we find in the Buddha's purported first sermon. So if we look at the Sutta on the Noble Search, which again, as I say, many scholars believe is the earliest depiction of the Buddha's enlightenment, we might get the idea that the Buddha's first discussions after his enlightenment were quite different from the one we find in this purported first sermon. As I say, if we look at that sutta, we'll see that the Buddha has discussions with Brahma Sahampati, with Upaka, and with these 5 disciples, and they're quite different. That said, this doesn't necessarily mean that the Buddha's first sermon wasn't his first sermon, in fact. Bhante Sujato, Bhikkhu Sujato, who translated this sutta and many other suttas, in fact, he has translations on Sutta Central online, he notes one particular place in this sutta on the Noble Search where perhaps that first sermon might be interpolated. In other words, he suggests that there is a place there where the Buddha gave this first sermon, and basically in this sutta on the Noble Search, it just doesn't appear there because it was left aside for another sutta. And that indeed is quite possible. However, there are a number of other historical and structural problems with this sutta that at least seem to suggest that this first sermon went through a period of changes and additions. The first problem with this first sermon, we might say, is that it comes across as much too well-polished and structured to be anything like a verbatim account of the Buddha's first sermon to anyone. And now this should not be surprising, of course. All of the suttas went through a period of redaction and change while they were being constructed. That is to say, we should never think of suttas like these as like digital recordings of the Buddha or anything of the kind. Instead, they would have been structured so as to be memorized, remembered, over a period of time. If the Buddha's first sermon was anything like this, it would have only been remembered by 6 people anyway. They would have had to remember it, memorize it, and clearly that would have changed it and made it more well-organized over a period of time. It would have been organized and clarified. But also there are particular problems with the wording that we find in this first sermon. In particular, the use of the phrase noble truth, very famous phrase in Buddhism. But to get to that, I think it's important then to turn to the content of this first sermon, where we can see this actually playing out. So third, I want to turn to the content of this first sermon. Now, we should keep in mind and remember that this sermon would have been given soon after the Buddha became enlightened and met up again with his first 5 companions. These, again, are the companions that he spent time with before he was enlightened, practicing all kinds of austerities. And they seem to have become disgusted with him, with Gautama, before he was enlightened, because Gautama, the Bodhisattva, decided to give up these austerities, feeling that they were not useful to him, and he gave them up because he was taking food. He took food, and by taking food, when the other 5 companions saw him eating, they felt that he'd gone soft and became sort of disgusted with his decision to give up his practice, and they left. So here, what we're seeing now, and what we see depicted in the sutta on the Noble Path that I mentioned before, or the Noble Search, I should say, is they come back to him. They see the Buddha, the now Buddha, and come back to him. And they're somewhat wary because they think here he is, a person who has given up his austere practices, who's become soft. But yet he seems, at least the discussion says, the sutta says, that he appears to them different. He's changed somehow. And so that raises an immediate question, and that will be the question that starts off this first sermon, which is, how is it that the Buddha has changed, given that he's abandoned his austere practices, which these 5 ascetics believed were absolutely essential to achieving that kind of change? In other words, these 5 ascetics, who are coming back to the Buddha now, seem to have continued their austere ascetic practices, and so they're a little confused about what's going on. And the Buddha's first speech to them is on this very topic. And what he says is this: "Mendicants, these 2 extremes should not be cultivated by one who has gone forth, that is, from lay life. What 2? Indulgence in sensual pleasures, which is low, crude, ordinary, ignoble, and pointless, and indulgence in self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, and pointless. Avoiding these 2 extremes, the Tathagata, that is the Buddha, became fully enlightened by understanding the middle way of practice." And this middle way of practice is explicitly noted as the Eightfold Path. Now, this part of the sutta is not likely to be original to the sutta, because the idea of an eightfold path of practice is likely to be a later development coming out of the Buddha's teaching career. What we're seeing in the Buddha's first sermon is somebody who has just come out of his own learning, and his own learning was really not involved with all 8 parts, at least not to any great degree. It would have been involved with, let's say, right intention, in particular renunciation, these ascetic practices that the Buddha did. It would have been involved with meditation, with deep forms of samadhi. It would have been involved with right effort. But other aspects of it, such as mindfulness, such as the ethical path, such as right view, and so on, would have been well down on the Buddha's actual practices before his enlightenment. Not to say he didn't have them, of course he did, but those are the kind of aspects of the path that most likely would have come up later on during his teaching career. Now, we should note here that the Buddha distinguishes indulgence in sense pleasures from self-mortification. There are different problems with each. For example, the Buddha says that sense pleasures are low, crude, and ordinary. Self-mortification is painful, while both of them are described as being ignoble and pointless. That is to say, everyone enjoys sense pleasures, so they're ordinary. They're also low, which the Pali word is hina, as in hinayana. Some of us will know that derogatory term that's sometimes used in Mahayana. Hinayana is the low path. Here, low sort of means inferior or base, something that doesn't work as well. They're also described as being crude. The Pali word is gamma. Gamma means basically that it's village life. It's from the village. It's not high. And village life has the connotation of sexuality, that there's something vulgar about it. And the idea of it being low and crude in these ways, that has a sort of an ethical tinge to it, although clearly sense pleasures are not unethical, but there's at least a tinge of danger, of concern, of things being slightly unhealthy for us. Both extremes are described as being ignoble and pointless. Ignoble, or anarya, basically means that they don't live up to the noble bearing of somebody who is on this kind of path, of a true ascetic. And pointless, anatta sanghita, is the most important thing. What that means is that these 2 practices of self-mortification and sense indulgence, these don't lead to the goal. They don't lead to the goal for which we gave up the lay life, or that for which ascetics of the day or monastics would give up lay life, or would go into retreat or solitary retreat, or whatever it might be. That is, these practices don't lead to enlightenment, and the Buddha is therefore saying that his old companions are not headed in the right direction. That is the answer he gives to them. The true direction, headed towards enlightenment and freedom, is, of course, many of us will know, the middle path, this path between sensual indulgence and self-mortification. That is the main first point of the Buddha's first sermon, this Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. The second major point in this purported first sermon is, again, what's supposed to be, or apparently is, the Buddha's first expression of the Four Noble Truths. But here is where scholarship finds some strange inconsistencies that lead us to believe that there were some later interpolations into the message of this sutta. To begin with, there are some concerns over how we translate noble truths exactly. The Pali term is Arya Satya, which again is ordinarily translated noble truth. However, a number of scholars note that it's not really supposed to be the truths that are noble, but it's rather that they're truths of the noble ones. That is to say, the noble ones understand, see, and realize these truths, or they're ennobling truths. They're truths that make us noble. We can also understand them as realities. In other words, this term satya, which is translated truth, has a number of different related meanings in Pali. One of these is truths, which is a property of sentences or propositions. Another way to understand it is simply the realities of the world. That all said, in what follows, I'll just be using the phrase noble truths because that's become the standard translation, but we'll have to understand that that might not be exactly accurate. In this sermon, the Buddha expresses each noble truth in three ways. First, he simply expresses it as a noble truth, presumably something to be understood, grasped on a kind of an intellectual level. Second, it's expressed as a task that we're supposed to perform. And third, we're supposed to understand it as a task which has been performed. For example, for the first noble truth, he says, "This is the noble truth of suffering." Then, this noble truth of suffering should be understood. That is to say, we're supposed to put understanding, we're supposed to understand something. What we are supposed to understand, I'll get to in a minute. And finally, we're supposed to see that this noble truth of suffering has been completely understood. That is to say, these three tasks, or I should say these three ways of understanding this first noble truth, we begin with, again, a sort of an intellectual understanding. Perhaps it's the sort of thing that would be completed as we reach what's known as stream entry, where we have a sort of a deep grasp, but only on a relatively superficial intellectual level of the content or character of this first noble truth. Secondly, we're tasked with understanding suffering. That is to say, understanding all of its role in our lives, understanding how it permeates all of our experience. And finally, at the end, we're supposed to understand that, or we're supposed to get to the place where we see that suffering has been completely understood. That is to say, if we could ever get to a place of enlightenment, we would understand the task had been completed, that we had seen the extent of suffering. Now, this strange inconsistency that I mentioned, it comes up most plainly when we look at the formula for the second noble truth. This is what we read in that sutta. This is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. This noble truth of the origin of suffering should be given up. In this case, we're not occupied by the task of understanding, but rather by the task of giving up. However, what we're supposed to be giving up is craving, presumably. We're not supposed to be giving up the noble truth. And this is where this kind of strange inconsistency of language rears its head. That is to say, the sutta doesn't make a lot of sense as it's presented to us. we're not really supposed to give up the noble truth of the origin of suffering. We're supposed to give up the origin of suffering itself, that is, craving. This is why, for example, K.R. Norman, who's perhaps the greatest Pali scholar of the last decades, believes that this term Arya Satya, or noble truth, was not originally a part of this sutta at all, but that it was added later. K.R. Norman looks to other recensions of the same material that we find in other places, such as the Mahāvastu, the Lalitavistara, which are somewhat later texts, but that have the same material, as well as one other early sutta from the Pali Canon, to find what he believes is the original form of these Four Noble Truths. Or we might say the original form that this discourse might have been given in, or something more like it, anyway, which is, I truly understood this is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. That is, the use of the phrase noble truths really isn't necessary in this case, in these cases. So this is an example of where this phrase, noble truths, or this word Arya Satya, may have been interpolated at a later date once these four different things became understood as truths, or as the ways of understanding reality, rather than just as themselves, as suffering, as the origin of suffering, as the cessation of suffering, and as the path. Now, to be clear, if this word Arya Satya was inserted at a later date, it doesn't make an enormous difference in the meaning of the sutta. This is a relatively small change. However, it does illustrate how these kinds of changes might happen over a period of time as things accreted, as things were put into places where they hadn't been originally. Anyhow, given this modification, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta tells us that we have four tasks: to understand suffering, to give up the origin of suffering, to realize the cessation of suffering, and to develop the path leading to the cessation of suffering. And this sermon ends with one of the Buddha's first 5 followers, a man named Kondanya, having apparently grasped the point that the Buddha was trying to make. And the Buddha is very excited about this. He says, Kondanya has understood. Kondanya has understood. And what this means is that Kondanya has reached what's called stream entry. He's broken through, he's seen it. He no longer doubts the Buddha's message. He, however, and his other 4 compatriots, the 5 first followers of the Buddha, will not become enlightened until, at least traditionally, the end of the second of the Buddha's first 2 sermons. So the upshot here, I think, that we can begin to see is that this text, while extremely important, was unlikely to have been literally the Buddha's first sermon, at least as it comes down to us. It's a heavily reworked text. That said, it has some very important messages, and that's presumably why it became known as the Buddha's first sermon. It's presumably from a relatively early period and contains the messages of the idea of the middle path, a middle way between extremes, which the Buddha will make a lot of use of in his teaching, as well as this idea of these 4 noble truths, either understood as noble truths, which, as I've said, seems to be a somewhat later development, or simply understood as these 4 things that we're supposed to do, these 4 tasks we're supposed to undertake. Now, I haven't described these tasks in any great detail here in this video. However, I did a series of videos, 4 videos, about each of these 4 noble truths, and I'll leave a link to a playlist of those videos up here on the screen if you haven't seen them or would like to see them again. If you're getting something out of all of this material that I'm presenting, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.